Now in this lecture, let's talk about the Microsoft 365 Copilot Architecture because I find it fascinating to understand how the prompt basically flows over from a user's device all the way to Copilot and then what Copilot does at the backend in order to return the response that it does to us. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about Microsoft 365 Copilot, which means that the Copilot is accessible and knows about your organization's data completely because it is within the 365 tenant that you have for your organization. Now, if you look over here, you have the users and the devices that you would have as part of your organization. And those computers, for example, will have the applications installed on the device. It could be the Edge browser, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams, whatever. These are applications that we use every single day. And these now have Copilot embedded within them. So once a user, let's say, enters a prompt into the application and the Copilot application running inside one of these apps, what really happens? The thing to keep in mind is that Copilot can only access the data that an individual user is authorized to access based on, for example, the existing M365 role based access controls. And Copilot cannot access the data, obviously, that you don't have authorization to access. So let's say that there are a couple of files sitting on a SharePoint folder that you as a user are not authorized to access, then those cannot be included within the response that 365 Copilot will return to you. I think this makes sense. Now let's take a closer look. In a Microsoft 365 application, a user will enter a prompt in Copilot. Now, the first thing that Copilot does based on the prompt that you have entered, it will pre-process the input using something called grounding. And what grounding does is that it will first of all access the Microsoft Graph API on the backend to access all of your user data. So it can be the inbox that you have within Outlook. It is all of your team's messages. It is the files that you're allowed to access on SharePoint. Scan the files, the documents, the PDFs that you have in Outlook, and that is the first step that it will do. Now, in the diagram, pay close attention that the grayed out area that we have over here, all of these files, this represents the data that Copilot cannot access simply because you as a user do not have access to those files. And what this process of grounding does is that it just does not take your raw prompt completely. It improves the specificity of your prompt and helps you get answers which are relevant and actionable to your specific task by also improving the context, looking at all the data that you have across the different Microsoft applications, as well as other data that Copilot may discover. And then once it understands the kind of data that you have access to, your prompt gets modified a little bit and then it gets sent over to the large language model that is being hosted, and it's known as the Azure OpenAI service subscription for Microsoft 365. Now the responses that are flowing all over the place end to end, they are all encrypted in transit, so just keep that in mind. And then once the grounded prompt has been sent over to the LLM sitting on the backend, you can think of that as a 4.0 model or the model that Microsoft is hosting at the backend. Then the LLM will use the new prompt, which was as a result of the grounding aspect, and it will generate a response that is contextually relevant to what you're asking it to do. And then the response basically flows back to Copilot and it will eventually get displayed in your application. So the high level thing to keep in mind is that Copilot just does not take over your raw prompt completely and sends that over to the LLM. It will perform something called grounding, use the Microsoft Graph API to look at all the data that you have sitting within your 365 space, your emails, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams messages, gather all of that information, understand the kind of data that you have access to, modify your prompt, and then send that over to the LLM. So the LLM can now give you a much more contextually aware response, and then that gets presented over to you within your browser or whatever application you're using. So this was the architecture for 365 Copilot. I hope that you found this interesting, and I will see you in the next one.